what's up? Jeff Ratcliffe here. aDOT. You've seen it before, I'm sure, but what the heck does it mean? Average depth of target. It's how far downfield a quarterback is throwing the ball on average. So how far does that ball travel in the air? The further downfield, maybe the more upside for fantasy purposes. So aDOT better be in your repertoire as a fantasy secret weapon. Now let's take a look at last year's average depth of target numbers at quarterback. We'll give you the top 10 here. You see it at the very top. Jameis Winston, 10.8 yards downfield on average. Now we know Jameis Winston wasn't out there under center for the entire season. Ryan Fitzpatrick was also under center for Tampa last year. And we know that it was a bit of a bumpy ride for Jameis Winston until the end of the season. From week 11 on, Jameis was a top 10 fantasy quarterback, and you have to like that vertical aspect of this game, this offense for this team. We have Mike Evans in that offense. You have Chris Godwin in that offense. You have O.J. Howard, a tight end who can actually get downfield as well in that offense, and we know Jameis has a big arm, plus the fact that Bruce Arians typically likes to run some vertical concepts. So expect this number to continue. This is one of those numbers, when I see it, I say to myself, yeah, Jameis has upside this year. And the nice thing about Jameis Winston is, yes, you're not drafting him as one of the top 10 quarterbacks off the board. Of course, the downside to Jameis Winston is we've seen in the past that, he potentially can have some, poor fantasy performances, a low weekly fantasy floor. But couple that with the upside that you have with this particular stat, especially, then I think it might be worth the risk. You're going to have to pair him up with a safer quarterback option, maybe a Phillip Rivers or something like that. But Jameis Winston has some major upside this year, and this stat certainly supports it. You see Josh Allen at number 2 at 10.5 yards downfield on average. Now, I will say that younger quarterbacks, their average depths of target tend to be further downfield. They take more of those risks. And just because you're throwing it downfield doesn't mean you're making good throws downfield all the time. But this at least says, hey, there's upside with Allen. We know that with his legs there's upside as well. I think when you look at that, though, and you have Robert Foster, a guy who can get downfield. You have John Brown in this offense now, a guy who can get downfield for you. All of that means that we could potentially see some big weeks out of Josh Allen. Now, that being said, he's a young quarterback still early in his development, so there could be some rough weeks along the way as well. So keep that in mind. Josh Allen certainly worth a late-round upside dart in your fantasy drafts, but that's about it with him. Temper your expectations entering the season. You have some interesting names. Speaking of young quarterbacks, some interesting names there, all tied at 9.0. Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Mitchell Trubisky. Baker can spin it. We know that after last year, and he's a popular fantasy pick. What I think, believe it or not, even though the number was relatively high last year, I think we see that number go up this year, and he's throwing even deeper downfield because the addition of Odell Beckham Jr. I mean, this number is where it is, and his primary target, his number one target was Jarvis Landry, who's a guy who's not going to be targeted heavily downfield. So we could see it even deeper for Baker. That means more upside for Baker on any given week. You got to like that. Darnold, we may not see that number move, but at least the number does suggest some upside, certainly for Robbie Anderson. Darnold's a deeper name to know for fantasy purposes as well. Maybe not in one quarterback leagues, but certainly going to be relevant in two quarterback leagues. May end up being a streamer in your one quarterback leagues. And then, of course, Mitchell Trubisky comes in with a lot of upside. I expect that number to stay relatively stable this year. Hopefully, Allen Robinson hits the ground running this year. Wasn't himself last year after coming off that torn ACL. Anthony Miller was banged up all last year as well. So, Mitchell Trubisky, a nice number for him. And he is one of those late-round guys with upside. Of course, Patrick Mahomes at 8.8. This shows you sort of what we're talking about here. There's a lot of upside, obviously, with Patrick Mahomes. I don't need to tell you anything you don't already know about Patrick Mahomes at this point. But I do think I should point out some of the names who aren't on this list, right? Guys who aren't throwing the ball very heavily downfield. The second lowest number last year, tied for the second lowest number, Derek Carr, just 6.6 yards downfield. Now, what did that really have to do with it? I mean, obviously earlier in the season, he just didn't have a connection with Amari Cooper, and then he was out of the mix, and they really didn't have any wide receivers after that point. I mean, when you're relying on an aging Jordy Nelson, Marcel Aitman at the end of the season, and then really primarily Jared Cook, your average depth of target isn't going to be very far downfield. I expect this number to certainly increase with Antonio Brown there, with Tyrell Williams there. But if we see this number stay the same, that will be a big knock for certainly Derek Carr, but also for Antonio Brown. So keep that in mind. It's a number we definitely want to monitor. By the way, I don't think that you say, all right, well, this is his number for last year, so therefore it's going to be the same number this year. We can certainly see some improvement in this area and him taking more shots downfield. But last year he certainly didn't, and we know that he wasn't a fantasy factor. Likewise, Matthew Stafford wasn't a fantasy factor last year either. And this is a guy who historically, there were times where he was a QB1 or borderline elite. I mean, he has a 5,000-yard passing season under his belt. But, last year, he wasn't even close to the fantasy radar. Fourth lowest at 6.7 yards on average downfield. That number for me, it's not one that I think is necessarily stable, and we just expect that number to be there again this year. But if it stays there, we have to be careful with Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones to a lesser extent, because you figure Galladay's not necessarily a guy who's going to make most of his fantasy production in the short and intermediate areas of the field. He's a guy who's going to get downfield, make bigger plays. So we want to see Stafford get back to taking more shots downfield this year, ultimately, especially for him to even be close to fantasy relevant, but really for Kenny Galladay's purposes, primarily because he is such a popular option. Now, and again, I guess, with some of this, though, the further downfield, the more big play upside you have. But if you have receivers who can, certainly do damage after catch, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be taking deep shots downfield. And I think the great example of that is Cam Newton. Last year, 7.0 average depth of target. So not far downfield whatsoever. He was among the league lows there. But when you have a guy like DJ Moore, when you have a guy like Curtis Samuel, when you have a guy like Christian McCaffrey, who you can hit in that short and intermediate area of the field, and they can make plays with their legs, it certainly changes things. It's not to say that Cam isn't going to take those shots, but he may not necessarily need to. So while it's certainly a fantasy secret weapon, we can't just use aDOT independent of everything else. We kind of have to know exactly what's going on in the offense, why the quarterback's throwing the ball to where he's throwing the ball, and then is that an impact ultimately not only on his fantasy value, but on his receivers. In some of these instances, certainly it is. In other instances, it may not be. Cam Newton last year, before the injury, the shoulder at the end of the year, and he was battling that through most of the season, he was rattling off games with multiple touchdowns. Go back and look at his stats last year. He was pretty consistent passing for touchdowns. So not a huge knock on Cam, but it is one of those, if you want that deep, big play upside, you may want to look otherwise or elsewhere from Cam Newton this year. If you want to see these average depth of target numbers, you can check those out and more over at PFF.com.